by dating conduct.
Okay. Thank you. As I mentioned, today I'll be speaking on semantic integration and serial verb nominalization in Akan and Yoru, so it's a comparative study. And this is actually taken from the data analysis section of my chapter for one aspect of the data analysis. Some of the predictions that we have are that nominalization will be possible for some types of serial verb constructions, SVCs, while not possible for other types. Also, nominalization will be different for different types of SVCs where nominalization is at all possible. So our hypothesis is that scalar degrees of semantic integration or idiomaticity and subsequent lexicalization will be the primary factor in terms of whether or not various types of SVCs will be able to be nominalized and how indeed nominalization will occur. So it's seeing that semantic integration is the primary factor. Let's get down to the section that we see here in red. Ranking high on the scale of integration are those verbal combinations that have become fully lexicalized into verb compounds and which are used as lexicalized idioms. So this is where it comes in, where we're talking about idiomaticity, how idiomatic something is. So these are what are called fully lexicalized, and in abbreviation we refer to them as FLISVCs, fully lexicalized integrated serial verb constructions. The next on the scale are partial lexicalized. And these are verbs that are still unitary to some degree, but it's less so than full lexicalized. And then finally, we have those that are used to express multi-events. These are referred to as chaining serialization. So this is a bit of the background in terms of what we're speaking about. And this is coming from Osan, 1994. So let's go a bit into it so that we can understand. So full lexicalized integrated serial verb constructions as idioms, that they express the idea that you have J and D as a combination to express an abstract notion. And we can see that in the fact that the two words can be used as a nominal. So we have something that starts off as a serial verb, but it can be made into a nominal. So J individually translates to receive or take, and then D translates to eat. But when they're used together, it's to believe, and they can be used as a nominal belief. Similarly, fa, to take, and then chet, to distribute, can translate to forgive, or as glossed as forgive, and can be used as a noun to mean forgiveness. Also, kumbu, to lose a battle, can be nominalized into inkubu, or kubu, and then sufre, call, becomes sufre, cries or supplications. So this is something that we see that those that are fully lexicalized have a pattern of being able to be made into nouns. Now let's go to the idiomatic part. So idioms, practically all such expressions are more or less limited in their morphosyntactic freedom, that generally substitution of lexical items in these expressions is limited to some extent, and that there are many with idiosyncratic semantic characteristics. So because it's not compositional, because it's not that you just look at this one verb and that one verb and it gives you the meaning of the combination, they're in a sense idiomatic. And in terms of dealing with idioms, there are certain factors that were introduced by Barkimla in 1996 that let you know how idiomatic something is. An example is flexibility. How flexible is the expression? So can it take different grammatical forms? And some of the examples he gave are, can you change the number? If you're saying it's raining cats and dogs, can you change that to say it's raining cat and dog? Or if you're saying the bottom of the ladder, can you change it to bottom of political ladder, bottom of social ladder? These go into how flexible the expression is. And specification, can they be specified? Other morphological marking, for example, in Akan, is it subject to reduplication? Can you say that there's something that's wrong with that, as opposed to mijinodi, which is the common expression. However, you can have something like mitoto moba bobo ama, which may be marginal, or just mitoto moba bo ama, so you're having a reduplication of the toto, and then the bobo is even marginal as to whether or not you can mark that for reduplication. But we would stick maybe with toto moba bo ama, but the fact that it can be reduplicated lets you know there's some degree of flexibility for this type, whereas it's not as flexible for this other type. Collocability. Can you switch in and out synonyms and antonym alternatives? So for example, going back to the example we're using, GD, can you switch one out and say, oh, Majinori, and it means to someone that, oh, I believe the person, or Majinonon, or Mifanudi, so we're taking out the J and then we're taking Fa. You know, what would that mean? If it's not able to be switched out with synonyms and antonyms, it lets you know that these are highly collocated and you can't just switch them out. Compositionality. So this is a result of the meanings. Do the individual meanings contribute to the overall meaning? So for example, we have receive and eat for JD. How does that go into believe? All right. If it's not compositional to the point where you can look at this and determine what the overall meaning will be, it lets you know that this is something that is very highly lexicalized. Also familiarity, institutionalization, the meaning and pragmatic function within the speech community. Will someone understand Bijinudi as I believe him or her, or as literal counterfeit form that I receive this person and I eat the person? The degree to which everybody will look at Bijinudi as I believe him lets you know that it's become institutionalized in the speech community. All right, so let's look at full lexicalized ISVCs dealing with those particular factors. So FLISVCs, we cannot derive the meaning of the compound from the meanings of the component parts, even though here there are degrees. So for FLISVCs, usually they're not compositional. You can't look at this one verb and this other verb and come up with the meaning of the overall construction. Usually they're inflexible in the sense that they're not able to be specified in these ways. They're not able to change the number, and they're not subject to other morphological marking as a tendency. They're usually collocationally closed in the sense that you can't switch in one synonym or one antonym for the other one, that the idiom has to stay as it is. You can't change from it's raining cats and dogs to it's raining hogs and flies and expect people to accept that form. Also, it's usually familiar, it's been institutionalized that this is how it works and this is what's known in the speech community at large. Let's look at those same factors for partial lexicalized. Even though the two verbs code a unitary event, in these verb combinations we can almost see the separate parts of the event. So this is a separate type of SVC. For example, if we take to and bo, to throw at, we can see that act of throwing in it, we can see that act of hitting, even though it's seen as a unitary event, like there was an intentionality in throwing the stone at someone. They're also usually partially compositional, that you can look at the to and it still retains its meaning in the overall construction. You can look at the ball, it still retains its meaning, as opposed to like a GD type of thing. That's also usually semi-flexible in the sense of being subject to reduplication and all these other morphological processes. Usually collocationally limited. It may not be as frozen as the full lexicalized, but it may allow for some type of other forms. And we'll come back to that point. Also, they're usually partially familiar, somewhat institutionalized in the sense of to and bo. That's something that lets you know that something was thrown and something was struck, as opposed to pim or something else. You know what I'm saying? So it's very familiar in the community. All right, so clause chaining serial constructions, which are CC for clause chaining or CSC for chaining serial constructions. So clause chaining serial constructions are a combination of clear cases of concatenation of verbs to code multi-events. So it's not seen in the speech community as one unitary event, and one behavior that shows that is that conjunction insertion does not significantly affect the overall meaning. So usually they're fully compositional. What each verb means in the sentence is what it means overall. Usually flexible in the sense of being productive, usually collocationally open, that you can switch in one synonym for another antonym depending on what you want to say. Usually non-familiar, not institutionalized. So this is a list that you have of Akan FLISVCs on page 5, slide 10. So we have a lot of examples. Yi, ma. So yi translates to remove and ma to give. However, the overall construction lets you know betray or to donate. Ji, di is the example we've been using to believe. Kun, gu, su, fore. And these were taken from Osam's thesis, Osam 94, where he gives a comprehensive list. So for a lot of these, we're seeing on the right that these can be made into nouns. We have a couple however, question marks for, we have kan and gu. However, in Kangul, we're actually going to go into some of the data that was returned from our questionnaire in terms of the acceptability of this. Also, another one that had a question, this was in Professor Osam's original Su-Ma as to sympathize. However, I would put this in a separate category under partial lexicalized as opposed to full lexicalized. Functional partial lexicalized, which deals with benefactor. Let's continue. Page 6, Yoruba FLISVCs. That again, we see the pattern that all of these have very institutionalized noun counterparts, just as we saw was the pattern for Akan FLISVCs. So we have dan, wo, to polish, and then to look. That's the idea for test. The overall meaning of that is test. But one thing I want to call your attention to is that in Yoruba you have something where they've become so lexicalized and being seen as one event that sometimes it's almost impossible to determine what the original verbs were. Now we know that these were verbs originally because a verb in Yoruba typically has a CV structure, but these verbs, when they come together, are CV. And there are actually a couple of papers, one by Ogunwale, another one by Bamboshe, which deal with how there are issues in the decompositionality of these Yoruba SBCs trying to get back to the original meaning. So this means that they've become lexicalized to the point that we know it was a verb, but we can't really ascertain the meaning of the individual verb outside of this context. Let's continue. Akan, PLISVCs. Again, these are the ones where you can see the individual event. They're unitary in a sense, but you can still see this event and that event, and they still mean the same thing in that context. So you can see the pour and you can see the gu for shiegu, etc. So all of these are less lexicalized. So for the Akan PLISVCs, from the data that we had, and again, we used a compendium, is Chi and Simfuan Korenkre Chirobia, which is basically a compilation of all words at that time that were seen as existing in Chi. And from that, none of them had nominal forms. The only one that had a nominal form was Shiegu. And when we put it out to current speakers, a lot of speakers did not produce this form. They did not have this as a nominalized form. So we'll come to that point as well. Yoruba PLISVCs, again, these are verbs that you can see the individual parts of them. They're related and they're unitary events, but they're not as lexicalized. And for these ones that were less lexicalized, that you had a pattern where typically they could not be made into nouns. And when I say typically, there were some exceptions, and this is why we're dealing with it as a scale or a gradient. There are fuzzy boundaries. This is a synchronic snapshot of a language, and there are fuzzy boundaries where for some speakers, it's moving from PLISVC to FLISVCs, but it's not total. For the ones that are fully situated in FLISVCs across the board, you had all speakers saying that, yes, this is a noun. But for the ones that were somewhere at the border, you may have had 50% saying that, yes, it could be made into a noun, and 50% saying, not so sure. So this is language in transition. For Akan CSCs, basically these are sentences which contain chaining constructions that have been made into nouns. Usually the ones that can be made into nouns are those that may have been proverbs and may have been common expressions, and they can be made usually into personal names. They can be made into toponyms, dealing with locations and things like that, or they can be praise names. But these are very highly idiosyncratic in terms of which sentence can be frozen into making a noun. So some of the examples, and when we're dealing with CSCs, we're dealing with non-familiar forms. And for a lot of those who responded to the data, these weren't familiar, so when I gave them, for example, bre and then hunum, just those verbs, they had a very hard time coming up with this idea, which is one of the praise names of the Supreme Being, just from getting those two verbs. So these are less familiar. You have to just know that this is a noun before you can come up with it from just looking at the verbs. And then similar thing for Yoruba CSCs, these are mainly in the form of proper names. So again, these are highly idiosyncratic in terms of when just sentences, random sentences that are recognized as nouns and those that are not. So let's look at the pattern. FLISVC nominalization. For the most part, tables in the questionnaire distributed to respondents were broken down based on degree of semantic integration. So I would give them an entire table of FLISVCs, and by and large, speakers were able to return that all of these can be nominalized. Then for the table of PLISVCs, speakers tended to give back that no, these cannot be nominalized, and so forth and so on. So let's go down to PLISVCs and CC nominalization. So partial lexicalized IFVCs typically do not have nominalized forms. Also, clause chains also typically do not have SVN counterparts, except in cases where a random entire sentence, proverb, etc. is nominalized in the form of a personal name, toponym, or some other such expression. Now let's go, when we're dealing with SVCs, typically in the literature, linguists only look at the verbal elements, but there's a reason why we say SVC, serial verb construction, that sometimes these serial verbs constructions include other things such as so-called postpositions, which have been put out as relator nouns in some of the emerging literature. All right, so in the questionnaire, respondents were given the SVN form and were asked to decompose the form into its constituent verbs. Again, they were told specifically only give the verbs. However, consistently respondents would give not only the verbal elements, but they would also include the relator nouns where they occurred in the SVN structure. Let me give you an example. So here, we gave them motoho, which translates to procrastination. And a whopping 73% they were told only give me the verbs. However, they consistently gave the two verbs, bo, to strike, to throw, and then they also gave ho, which is there. All right, now there isn't a verb. However, they composed it to the things that are meaningful, the meaningful elements of the sentence. Whereas opposed to only 8.1% or 3 respondents only gave those two verbs. So initially I looked at it and said, oh, well, maybe it's a fluke. But we see this again with 90% of respondents were able to produce the form in fatohum when they were given the 3 elements, fa, to, and hum, while only 12.1% were able to come up with that same form in fatohum when they were only given the verbal elements fa and to without the relator noun hum. What this is letting us know is that not only are the 2 verbs highly integrated, also the hum is integrated along with it, in the sense that if you're not given all 3 together, it's very difficult for it to mean anything. All right? So let's look at that. So when they were given all 3 elements, 36 out of 42 total, or 90% gave me in fatuhum. They were given all 3 things that are meaningful there. When they were only given a fa and tu, only 4 respondents were able to say that you can make any kind of noun from just those 2 elements. All right? The implication of the data is that for native speakers, lexicalization and semantic integration extend not only to the verbal elements of SVCs, but to other elements which are part of the SVC. This phenomenon is similar to that of idioms and collocations, which require all elements of the idiom to be understood and intelligible. So for example, if I just say, oh, it's raining cats, people will wait for you to say the rest of it, like, are you going to sneeze? Say the rest of it. We see a similar thing for Yoruba SVNs that have a relator noun, and in this case, ile, translating to ground or down, that you have an abstract concept which is idiomatic. So we have iforibale, or obedience or homage. It comes from literally taking the head to touch the ground. That's the idiom that expresses homage or obedience. Also ifarabale, peace of mind, quietness. That the relator noun ile, grounded down, politicized, and elided onto the verb. And all elements have to be there for it to make sense. You can't just say fi and ba and have someone come up with iforibale. So let's deal with semantic integration and compositionality. A side effect of semantic integration in SVCs is the ambiguity of one or both verbs in the construction when taken individually. What we're saying essentially is that the meaning of this one and that one, for a lot of speakers, the pattern was that they don't mean anything unless they occur with the other one. Or even if they mean something, it's very hard for us to agree on what they mean. So let's look at the example we gave them in Kobu, and 91.7% were able to come up with the Kobu comes from the two verbs ko and gu. We had, people were very clear on that. People were also very clear on the meaning of kun when we just dealt with that verb. What does it mean of kun? Everybody said, oh, it translates to fight. So that is 22 of the respondents, 71%. Also, others gave it as defeat. I would actually lump these two together, and I'll come to the reason why I will lump those two together very shortly. So in total, we can say that 26 respondents were able to come up with that definition. However, when it came to gu, there was no consensus as to the meaning of gu. Some said that there was none, that they're not sure. It means pour, fall, sow, nurse, nothing, collapse, vein, spill, spread, and fail. This is because they've been integrated to the point that gu, they have to look at when gu is used in other contexts. Gu has a connotation in this context, which simply means that the first verb was not carried out successfully. So it's very difficult for people to come up with one agreed upon meaning of what gu is in this context because they've been lexicalized. This doesn't mean anything outside of the context of the two together. At least there's no consensus on what it means. So in short, semantic integration has occurred in this case to the point where the meaning of one verb in the SVC or SVN is no longer readily interpretable outside of the context of the entire unit. In other words, in cases of high semantic integration or lexicalization, the individual verb is meaningless or difficult or impossible to interpret outside of the context of the other elements it collocates with. And that's what we were seeing in the Yoruba case in terms of difficulty and decompositionality. What does this mean if it's not in this construction as a whole? Also, in the case of causative PLISVCs, this is a subset of PLISVCs. The inverse is also possible where the initial verb is uninterpretable without the second verb it collocates with. So an example, Kofi ma no shiase. Kofi caused, the third singular, to strike the base or strike down. So the ma is dependent on shiase. Without shiase, ma simply translates to give, and it doesn't have a causative connotation. This means that they've been lexicalized, they've been semantically integrated to the point that unless you have this other verb coming, the first one doesn't mean what it means in the entire construction. Also, without ma, the no could not be realized as accusative. This is a case of object sharing, where basically you've had a causative which has progressively become patterned as FLISVCs. So this type of object sharing is not monoclausal or biclausal, but sesquiclausal. You heard it here first. This is being defined as when two otherwise separate clauses are sharing one single clausal element. So you can't say it's one single clause. On the other hand, you can't say it is two separate distinct clauses, that they're sharing an element. And this is adapted from Hirawa and Bodomo. For those who saw Nana Yao, Mr. Dria's presentation, he had a similar thing. We actually worked on something like this earlier together. So this is being shared. So we can't say that these are separate. We can't say that they are one. That is something like a 1.5, if you will. So compositionality in data. Another aspect of data which points to semantic integration is that when respondents were asked to give the meaning of individual verbs, instead they gave the meaning of the composite of the two together. This is why I said before when we were looking at the meaning of kun, to fight, that I would also include defeat in there as well. That for many speakers, and let me go through this point first, lexicalization follows from semantic integration. So what I'm saying is that the form, the morphosyntactic structure, follows the function. That as a speech community comes to see formally separate events as progressively more and more connected and unitary, the syntactic in the sentence and morphosyntactic in the word characteristics of once distinct lexical items come to reflect this view. Though through lexicalization, which is observable in syntactic and morphosyntactic behavior, the form follows the function. So to come back to our point, when they were asked to give the individual meaning of kun and gu, they said defeat, which is actually the meaning of the composite. For a lot of speakers, these came together. So for the initial time I saw this was on Oyima translating to betrayal. That when I asked them to give the meaning of just yi, they gave it as betray or to give. That oyima translates to betrayal or donation, something like that. But they gave this. They didn't give individual ones, they gave the composite meaning, and that was it. So at first I said, okay, well maybe it's a fluke, maybe they just weren't reading the directions. However, we saw this time and time again. Example was on jidie. They were asked to give the meaning of ji alone. And 24%, which again, in this case is not the majority were able to say take, get, or receive, which is the basic meaning of ji. However, again, 24.3% gave it as a composite meaning of the two together. All right? This was a pattern, also in Sochet, that this was a majority. 19 respondents out of the 42 respondents, or a little bit over 59%, gave the meaning of so as to try or to test. Others gave it as what it may mean in other contexts, to light, to catch or hold something, etc. Same thing in Fatuhum. This, again, was a significant amount that they were asked to just give fa. Now, if I asked them outside of the context of Fatuhum, I think everyone who's a native speaker could say, okay, fa translates to take. But again, they were given it in context, language in context, and consistently they gave the meaning of the composite together. Again, this data is pointing to an idea that for native speakers consistently, at least statistically significantly, they're seeing the two as unanalyzable without, outside of the context of the unit. Also dealing with decompositionality of clause chaining SVNs. A similar series of responses were provided for the clause chaining data where each element of the SVN was defined by respondents, including the infixes or nouns along with the verbs from which a nominalized form is derived. So an example of that, they were given kashem kodu, which translates to safe arrival, but it's it means actually the opposite of what it's saying. It's saying, I hope you don't arrive safely. But as opposed to just giving me kan and kodu, they would also put the shin in, because for them, without the shin in there, it doesn't mean anything, so they would define all of them together. So again, this speaks to degrees of integration. So a nominalized CC is presented as an instantaneous idiomaticity, that speakers of the language have just decided that we can freeze this particular sentence and make it into a noun, make it into something that's not completely compositional. So nominalized CC, it goes from something that's fully compositional to non-compositional. Like my name, for example, Abadele, it translates to the king arrives at the house. However, when someone calls my name, they're not saying, oh look, the king has arrived at the house. It's not compositional. It's not the meaning of the sentence anymore. It's something that's been frozen instantaneously. It goes from something that's inflexible, just like a sentence like the king has arrived at the house, to something that's inflexible. It's a frozen name now. It goes, or it can go from one type of inflexible in the sense of a proverbial expression to another type of inflexible, which is a name, sometimes accompanied by an inflexible abbreviation in the speech community. For example, in Yoruba land, my name can only be abbreviated as Dele. However, non-speakers repeatedly will abbreviate it as Oba. And Oduyoye, Yoruba names, he talks about how Yorubas who were taken away to Brazil and were repatriated to Sierra Leone, they lost contact with the original speech community. So very commonly they would abbreviate things to morphemes that don't make any sense. So they would abbreviate, for example, as Bade, which is like cutting off half of this and half of that. So it's not done in the speech community. It goes from something collocationally open, where you can put in synonyms and antonyms, to collocation limited or completely closed. It goes from something that's less familiar, just a random sentence that I happen to say, to something that's very familiar in the sense of this is a name that we use in the speech community and we recognize and know this as an acceptable name. CCs can be nominalized through sentential nominalization, which again is very idiosyncratic and unpredictable. Now let's deal with semantic integration and morphosyntactic structure. So far we've dealt with integration of the two verbs, two or more verbs. We've also dealt with integration of the two verbs and the relator noun that is also part of the construction. Now we're going into semantic integration and the actual morphosyntactic structure. So part of speakers' knowledge about their language, and this is coming from Ajikun 2003, is that the morphemes within a word cannot be strung together in a random order. In view of this, the grammar of every language should contain word formation rules. Speakers may be able to produce FLISBCNs without even knowing the meaning of the SVN because of knowledge of a base template. Now the template is letting you know the slots that are possible and available in the language. So an example of this was motoso, which translates to the same thing as intratuso. However, people, which is false accusation. This was attested in Cristala's dictionary from 1875. However, I found that time and time again, synchronically, speakers now do not have this form of motoso. And this goes back to the idea of familiarity. Barkema deals with this in terms of currency of an expression. An example is certain things will mark you as an old speaker. For example, in English in the 20s, you have the verb cop, which is to take something or to get something. That at that time you could nominalize it as copper, which is a police officer. That's a marker of a 20s gangster type of person. So synchronically, if you say, oh, the coppers are coming, someone will say, what are you, Al Capone? What are you, a 20s gangster? That it has gone from an FLISBC to something that is no longer current, no longer familiar in the language. So we have that case for motoso or katoso, and then the one that was known and accepted was intratuso. Also in Kangul, this was one in the original table that had a question mark for it. Now, the one that is acceptable, which translates to rout, Kangul, by together meaning to rout or defeat someone in a battle. However, this seems to have, the possibility of this seems to have been replaced by a more familiar noun, which may even be blocking that from becoming a recognized noun. So a template form is a base form with one or more open function slots. A base form is the simplest form of an expression which contains a lexical items and exhibits the minimal syntactic or, in this case, morphosyntactic structure required for the specific meaning and or pragmatic function. The base form is always a constituent. So what are we talking about here? Here we had, when they were given bulk, so the majority of people who could make this a noun, they all agreed that the form of the noun had to be this, which was 30%. Or 10 respondents, they all had the same form. They were all able to come up with it. Whereas the majority on the whole said that they can't do anything with it anymore, as we mentioned. However, even though 30% were able to come up with this form, which is some degree of agreement, the majority had no idea what it meant. So even though I've just produced this form and I told you that this is what would come up from these together, I don't know what I just produced means. This means that there's an idea that the semantic integration is linked to the morphosyntactic structure itself. They say, I may not know what it means, but for it to mean anything in my language, it has to take this form. All right? Let's go to the other example we were looking at, Kangul. That again, we had consensus. People said, 30% said that if these two are going to mean anything as a noun, that noun has to take this form. All right? But then when they were asked, what's the meaning of this noun that you just created, the majority, which is 76%, said they have no idea what it means. And then another 17 respondents just didn't put anything there. So it wasn't something that existed for them. This is going to the idea that even if they don't know what the SVN means, they know that it has to have a particular structure for it to mean anything. So again, the semantic integration extends to the verbal elements, and it extends to the relator nouns, and then it also extends to the structure itself in terms of those which are possible. So in Akan, the word or term formation to be rules can be outlined as affixation, derivational rules, prefix, base, and suffix, compounding rules, affix, base, and then conversion rules, base X to base Y. Yoruba word formation rules are similar, except there's no suffix. You have the prefix and the base, affix, base N, base N. Then you have conversion rules, where you take the alpha consonant of the base, and then you extend it as the alpha consonant onto a prefix, which is partial reduplication. So you may have something like ga, to be tall, nominalized as giga, tallness. Ra, to buy, nominalized as rira, the act of buying. All right? So morphosyntactic structure itself contributes to and is integrated into the SVN. i.e. the speaker may not even know the meaning, but will know that for a potential SVN to mean anything at all, it has to follow a particular morphosyntactic structure. So the point of this is to get to some type of SVN typology. So we see that fully semantically integrated, that this is again a scale. So we're seeing these as moving up and down the scale. Where at the top of the scale are non-decompositional FLISVCs, those that are so semantically integrated we can't even pick them apart to come with the meanings of the individual ones. And also other FLISVCs. And the pattern, the typological pattern, is that these typically have SVN counterparts. All right, this is what we've seen in the data that's been returned for Akan, and we're also waiting for the Yoruba data. According to the written data, that's what we see in terms of attested forms. We're looking for verification from that, from the questionnaires that were also distributed. Partially semantically integrated, causative and other functional PLISVCs are more semantically integrated. They're not as semantically integrated as the FLs, but they're more semantically integrated than other partially lexicalized ones. And the pattern here is that usually these have no SVN counterparts. All right? Finally, we have non-semantically integrated CSCs or CCs, and usually these have no SVNs. They have no nominalized forms, except for idiosyncratically random sentential SVN counterparts, just in the sense of we've taken this and this can be a name. We took a whole sentence and made it into a name. Finally, to close out, my professor, my Yoruba professor, who was probably more responsible for me knowing Yoruba than anyone else, he passed away 2 weeks ago today. He was actually helping me collect the questionnaires, and I spoke with him a few days before I called, and his daughter told me that he passed away. So I wanted to do a dedication of this presentation to him. He passed away October 21st, so I would like to say to him, Ekui Wajuro, and thank you for your time.
Okay, thank you, Wale, for that interesting talk. Now is the time for questions and comments.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much for very interesting presentation. Now, since you're basing your judgments on respondents' judgment of these, could you please tell us a little bit more about your respondents? For example, age, sex, and what were the criteria you used in selecting these people?
This is very good. I'll actually pull up my data set so you can see it. What we did, we collected bio data from them, and then we processed the bio data in SPSS. And by and large, we had respondents. We were looking for those who would be able to fill out something like this, who have basic knowledge of what a noun is, what a verb is, and how to extract these types of things out. So by and large, these were, and then also who knew English well enough to be able to fill this out on their own. So by and large, we had educated speakers, those who are educated in Akan, and these were, and this is sorted out by this table. Students, teachers, those who have bachelor's, master's, for the most part, are what we had here. We had a good mix of males and females. We broke this down by gender as well, by age. Typically the ages were 21 to 40. And we were looking at getting data from the major dialects of Akan, 3 particular major dialects of Akan. We're looking at Asante speakers. So we went to Kumasi, KNUST, and got speakers from there. We're looking for Ekwapim speakers as well. We got some of those from Legon. And then also we're going to expand out. We got very few Fanti native speakers, but we're looking at going to UCC as well to get more of a base of those. So let me actually pull this up. I have a table that shows, the frequency of how many males, how many females, how many of a particular age group as well. But again, the main criteria we were looking for were speakers who would be able to fill this out without being supervised in defining noun, verb, and things like that.
So when you talk of speakers of any of them, were you looking at anybody who speaks any of that kind of dialect, or native speakers, people who actually, because that's also very important when you're doing this kind of thing.
Very good. We were looking at native speakers, and this is actually the table. Let me put this down onto one page so you can see it. So in our bio data, we asked people to identify what their native language was. From the 42 respondents, we had a cumulative total of 87.8%, and you can see this here. 87.8% who were native speakers of some dialect. 23 self-identified as Tree speakers, Asante, Achim. Fanti speakers were 3 respondents so far. 7, Ekwapim, 2 said that they are both Tree and Ekwapim. 1 said Tree and Fanti, perhaps 1 parent from each one. And then 5 said that they were not native speakers. So we were looking at data we were asking for native speakers, but we were also willing to look at those who are highly competent in the language who may not be native speakers.
And what was the age?
Very good.
Range?
Let's go back up. The age range, for the most part, we were looking at age ranges within 20 years. 21 to 40, we were looking also, would we get maybe 18-year-olds, whatever, but we didn't get any of those. By and large, they were in the range of 21 to 40, and then we had some 41s to 60. We were also hoping to get those who were 60 plus, however, we haven't gotten those as of yet. So the main portion were in this range. So in our bio data, we were looking at things that would have an impact, and age was one thing that would have an impact. We also wanted to look at other knowledge of other languages may also have an impact. So we also asked students or respondents, teachers, whoever, what other languages that they speak. You know, some also spoke Ewe, Guan, Krobo, Hausa, so we also documented that. And what we are looking to do as we continue with the data analysis is to process the data and see is there a correlation between, say, gender and a particular type of response, between level of education and another type of response, other dialects of Akan or other languages that are spoken in a particular type of response. So we do have all of those things factored in.
Any other question? I have a question on some of your terminologies. Maybe you need to improve.
Okay.
You're talking of lexicalization and semantic integration.
Yes.
Within the context of serial verb construction, they seem to me to be the same.
Right.
It seems to me that lexicalization essentially marks some degree of semantic integration.
Right.
What is the motivation for that distinction?
Right. I would separate them because I would say that lexicalization is an observable syntactic or morphosyntactic phenomenon. We can look at the behavior of some type of syntactic phenomenon and say that this is lexicalized. Semantic integration, I would say, is what causes lexicalization. So there's a cause-effect relationship. The speakers are looking at these events that are happening in the community, and they're coming to see them as unitary over time. As they come to see the events, the preceding events as unitary, that then reflects in the language of what they do with them. So for example, that also goes into the reason why, for example, you couldn't have an ISVC about a two-step process for shoveling snow in Chi. That's not something that occurs enough as an event that speakers of Chi, native speakers, would see that as highly semantically integrated as an event that happens enough that we would start to lexicalize this. So once people come to see these separate, before they were separate events, but as they come progressively to see it as more and more unitary, then that has an influence on what they do with the language syntactically and what they do with the language morphosyntactically.
mean, it's not very clear to me, but I'll.
Okay. I don't know how I can explain it better, but I do see these as being distinct. One is more of like a view of the world. Legon deals with this somewhat in Women, Fire, and Dangerous Things, of how people are looking at the world or their worldview. Also, Rosh deals with it in terms of you have empirical things that people in the speech community see. Once they see these empirical things, that has an influence on the language. So this is basically looking at it functionally, that the form of what you can observe morphosyntactically, the form of what you can see syntactically, is coming up because of how people are seeing these events. Before we saw them as completely separate events. Now we see them as a little bit separate. Now we see them as one event. And depending on how they see them determines what is going to happen morphosyntactically, and it determines what's going to happen syntactically. I don't know if that's any
Yes.
Yeah, I was looking at the relationship between what you're talking about and the so-called ICBs in Ghana and Akan. So would you say, for instance, an expression like Bodia or Bompire, would you say it's fully lexicalized or partially lexicalized?
That's a good question. I would say that would be determined. I wouldn't say conclusively. I would say that would be determined by native speakers, what they say that they can do with it. In my opinion, I would think that Bodria could be perhaps fully lexicalized. You can make it into a noun. I definitely wouldn't say it's some type of thing on par with the non-semantically integrated. The reason why I say it is that you can make it into a noun. Actually, it patterns, in terms of SVCs, it patterns like how partial lexicalized ones do, in the sense that there's a permutation in the nominalized form. So you have bo, jia, that can be nominalized as jiabo. That when you see permutation, it's usually the pattern that I've seen so far is that partial lexicalized SVCs are the ones that typically have the permutation. And we see it in like fa, hun, ma, that will permutate, the fa will come over to the other side as a hun, fa, ma, when it's lexicalized. So just on the basis of that feature, I would look at it as more patterning after what the partial lexicalized ones are doing.
Any more questions?
Could you have collected similar data using native, non-literate speakers?
Yes, I did actually have some non-native speakers here, and the reason why
Non-literate.
non-literate, it would be possible, but it would require a very different methodology. I wouldn't be able to use questionnaires, of course. I would need to go there and interview like perhaps older people in the village one by one, and then I would have to put all of these in context. I would have to use them in a sentence and ask them, is this a good sentence? Is this not a good sentence? That perhaps will be something I will do for my postdoctorate. However, at this point, going to one single village to get maybe 2 elders is not as feasible right now.
Yeah, but that's one way to verify those things that some of your respondents didn't have because you probably said that.
Right.
But let me take you to page 15 of the handout on the positive field ISPCs. Just a little where you have the sentence yes. And you said something about object sharing there. Okay, so what's the object that which verbs are sharing this object?
No. It's being shared by the ma, and it's also being shared by the shia, the shia, rather.
So
it's just the verb.
Are you saying that the node, for example, is the object of she also in this sentence?
No. I would actually, it would be better to say argument sharing, because it's an object of ma, but it's the subject of she. So that it would be better to say argument sharing in this instance rather than.
Wouldn't it also be possible to say that maybe And you know, this happens in two clauses. She also has its own clause. So isn't it the case of big pro as subject of she, and then of course it shares reference with the object of the ma, for example.
Right. This is actually a subject of many late night discussion. The behavior is what leads us to say that it's not. When we have like an all construction, and this is stepping into Nanaya's territory, when you have an all construction, you have adverbial insertion that can happen before the all. So, Oman, Oma, Imra, Oshiasi, that was seen as being good by speakers. So, and in that type of context, we're looking at these two types of clauses. We have a pro in there, etc. However, when you have the ma and the no, let me come back to our putative sesquicausal.
Did you say Oman, no, and Ra, Shiasi?
The Oma and Ra, or
Oma and Ra, or Shiasi.
Yes. Question?
Then the blue is no longer becomes form.
Okay. So, in terms of adverbial insertion, that can happen in the all construction, but it cannot happen in the no construction. Why can it not happen in the? You can't say Oma enra no shiasi or Oma no enra shiasi. You can't insert a verb. The reason why you can't do it is because you can't break up these constituents. And this type of structure was, again, proposed by Harawa and Bodomo. But the point is that when you have this one being shared in one clause, that's explaining why you can't insert an adverb here. That's explaining why you can't insert the adverb there. When you have that type of pro-construction that you're suggesting, you should be able to insert the adverb.
Maybe I'm old-fashioned, but I won't place my adverb where you place it. My adverb will add the sentence initial enra or manushiasi, right, or sentence minor or manushiasi enra.
That's how I would personally do it as well.
So
however,
that
based on
sentence is a little bit
marginal
for me. Anyway,
for that's actually going into his data. So do you have?
We'll look at that another time.
Okay.
Yes. Yes, we'll go into that. Well, I think when we talk about the causative, we need to make a distinction. And perhaps we're not talking about the same situation in these different sentences. The non-causative doesn't look bicausal at all. Perhaps we should not even refer to it as a sentence having some sort of embedding in it. Well, it used to, but due to these semantic motivations and what is happening in the no construction is that they're making it, the speakers, Asante speakers are making the no construction to look like cause-effect serialization. So, Kofi Bornokum. So that's what they're making the no construction. We used to be bicausal, so they're constructing it in a serial manner to reflect that thinking, that sort of structure in the language. So I would not even refer to this construction as having two different structures, two different clauses. Perhaps it's just a serial verb construction, which is a product of complement structure.
Right. This is looking at it synchronically. We're looking at behavior which is marginal for you. For me as well as marginal. I would personally put initial or final. But for some speakers, they're able to do that. Now, why can they do that? We're looking at the structure as being the reason why. So that initially it may have started off as an embedding that in other Kwa languages it patterns like the all type of construction. But in Asante, for them to change it to no, basically they've taken ma o shiasi and made it ma no shiasi to pattern after j no di what's something else. So basically they're looking at it as an analogy. They're looking at this is how the structure of an SVC is, and we're taking the causative and we're making it look like what the SVCs are doing. And the SVCs also, I would propose this type of structure because the causative is now behaving like how the SVCs are in terms of adverbial insertion, in terms of negation, and things of this nature.
Any more questions? All right, thanks very much. Let's put our hands together. Before we leave, our final research seminar talk comes up next week, the final for the semester. And it's going to be given by Mrs. Francisca Age. The topic is motion event expressions in early novels. So Wednesday at the same time in this room, you're all invited. Thank you very much. You? Scrap off sesame. Why can't we say yeah, we can just call the whole thing, just collapse the whole thing, and call it what it is because that's what it is.
Right. But then the question is, well, what is the structure of a field? How does it look like?
Okay, share. Argument share.
That's cool.
Well,
That's what I'm
you
just
doesn't have
having
anything closer. It doesn't, because actually, there's nothing else that you can do with that construction. You cannot say any other element. So it's like genuinely. So if it's genuinely, it's that much lexical. Then why not? We're not calling genuinely sex it's nothing closer.
Yeah, actually, so we have we actually haven't looked at the clause out of what's that structure. No.
Do you see the point that I'm
Yeah, I see the
making?
point.
So I'm going for the stronger version here, that we don't need to be in the middle on this one. There's no reason to be in the middle because it doesn't have any relics of a bicausal structure. It's not like it's trying to be bicausal, but it isn't.
Right.
It's not bicausal.
It's trying to be an SVC.
Exactly.
But then what does the SVC look like?
Well, that's your job.
That's my postdoctorate.
That's your job.
That means when you give me my degree, then I will